Hello, welcome to another opportunity to study God's Word together. My name is Nathan House, and I'm with the Houston Church of Christ. And if you could subscribe or like this video, that would be helpful to me. So please do that. And we're going to be back in Hebrews chapter 4. We're going to finish it up. We already kind of did that last time, but we're going to use that as we press on into chapter 5. If you watched the last video, you should remember that he is using an Old Testament passage, Psalm chapter 110, verse 4, kind of to build around this point that Jesus Christ is a high priest. Specifically, he's likening his high priesthood to that of Melchizedek. So again, we'll see that verse in just a moment, but that harkens back to what we talked about last time. So go back and watch that last video if you have not watched that just yet. But as we get into chapter 5, we do need to briefly look back at chapter 4, chapter 4, verses 14 through 16, which we already looked at. Because what he's going to do here is he's going to do a kind of a comparison and contrast. So in chapter 4, verse 14 through 16, he is talking about Jesus Christ, the high priest. And as he begins this discussion about Jesus Christ, the high priest, he calls them a great high priest. Since then, we have a great high priest. And he's going to contrast Jesus as a high priest to the Old Testament high priest, which we'll see in a minute. So this great high priest, Jesus Christ, has passed through the heavens. And he says, because of that, let us hold fast our confession. We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. And notice this phrase, weaknesses. We'll talk about that in a minute. So Jesus is able to sympathize with our weaknesses because he's been tempted just like every other human has. And again, this goes back to another Old Testament passage, Psalm chapter 8. Jesus Christ has been made for a little while lower than the angels. He took on humanity. During this time frame, he was made a little while lower than the angels. During this time frame, he was made into a human. He was made into humanity. During this time frame, he experienced temptations like we did. But the contrast, so he's tempted like every high priest was. He understands our weakness like every high priest does. But the contrasting statement is that Jesus Christ, as our high priest, was sinless. Now, this sets him up not only to be a great high priest because he's tempted, but it also sets him up to be the perfect sacrifice, which we've alluded to already, and we'll talk more about that in the future as well. But he's been tempted, but in contrast to the other high priest, he was without sin. But because of this great high priest who is tempted, this great high priest who is who can sympathize with us and who is without sin, because this high priest has passed through the heavens, let us hold fast. Let us then with confidence draw near, that we can receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Chapter 5, for every high priest, here's going to be some contrasting things that we'll notice. For every high priest, not like the great high priest in every way, but in some ways they're similar. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed. Just like Jesus Christ, every high priest is appointed. Jesus Christ was appointed. He was chosen. He was appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God. So the high priest, the Old Testament high priest, their job was to act as a mediator, as a go-between in a relationship between God and man. Every high priest was appointed for that. And real quickly, you'll just notice verse 5, also showing how Jesus Christ was also appointed or chosen, depending on your translation. So also Christ did not exalt himself. Christ didn't just take this job as high priest, but he was appointed. He was appointed by him who called him. He was chosen by him who called him. So again, go back to chapter 5, verse 1. For every high priest chosen from among men, and again, notice that word chosen. Every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men. That's their job. Their high priest is to act on behalf of men. Jesus Christ is a high priest to act on our behalf. Because of that, because he is the perfect high priest, the great high priest, because he was appointed, because he was chosen to act on our behalf, we can, with boldness, go to that throne of grace. Let's come back to this chapter 5. He is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God. He is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. But look at this. He is appointed to do this for sins. And again, notice this, for sins. You see, Jesus Christ was sinless, but these human high priests, who are appointed from among men, they also offered sacrifices. They also offered gifts. Real quickly, let's skip to the book of Leviticus, and let's look at chapter 16 real quick, and look at verse 11. Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself. See, the first high priest, Aaron, was not sinless like Christ was. He had to offer a sacrifice for his own sins. Verse 11 continued, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall kill the bull as a sin offering for himself. So the high priest appointed among men had to offer sacrifices and gifts. He had to kill an animal because he was not sinless. He had to offer a sacrifice for his own sins. Then you come down to verse 15. Then, after he's made a sacrifice for himself, then he shall kill the goat of the sin offering, that is for the people, and bring its blood inside the veil, and do with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull, sprinkling it over the mercy seat and in front of the mercy seat. So again, Jesus Christ was sinless. He doesn't have to kill animal sacrifices for his own sins. There was no sins that he had committed. He was the perfect sacrifice. He was the one chosen by God to be the perfect sacrifice. So again, we come back to this text. The Old Testament priests, high priests, had to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. Verse 2, he, the high priest of the Old Testament, he can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weaknesses. You see, he also understands weaknesses like Christ does. He understands them because he also yielded to temptation, because he also faced temptation. But in contrast to Christ, he sinned. Christ was a sinless sacrifice. Verse 3, this Old Testament high priest, because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifices because of his weaknesses, because of his giving in to sin. He is obligated to offer sacrifices for his own sins, as we just saw in Leviticus 16, just as he does for the people, as we just saw in Leviticus 16. And he says in verse 4, this goes back to verse 1, no one takes this honor for himself. Right? No one takes this honor for himself. The high priest is chosen from among men. He's appointed by God. He doesn't take this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. And you can cross-reference this. We're not going to go back and look, but you see Aaron's selection and his washing and all of that in Leviticus chapter 8. And you can go back and read that on your own. So he is called by God, just as Aaron was. Every high priest is called by God, just as Aaron was. Verse 5, so also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him. Just as Aaron was chosen by God, just as every high priest is chosen by God, in that same way, Christ did not take this position on himself, but he was appointed by God. By the same one who said to him, by the same one who said to Jesus Christ, we read this way back in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 5. You are my son. Today I have begotten you. And so here is another Old Testament passage. Psalm chapter 2, verse 7. And this psalm is an enthronement psalm. This is a psalm that is used. This is a psalm that was used when a king was chosen, he became God's son. So Jesus Christ is God's son. He is God's chosen king. He was chosen as king. He was chosen as son. The same one who appointed him as son and king said in another Old Testament passage, Psalm chapter 110, verse 4, not only are you a son, king, you are also a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. So here again, we have two Psalms, two Old Testament passages that are quoted, and they're pointing to two different aspects concerning Jesus Christ and concerning his work, concerning his role. He is a son and king. He is a high priest forever. Verse 7, in the days of his flesh. This again looks back at Psalm chapter 8, verse 4. He was made a little while lower than the angels. This was the time of his flesh. in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he was a king. And again, notice this phrase here. We see it here in verse 5. We see it here in verse 8. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And again, this goes back to chapter 2. Wrong passage. Here we go. This goes back to chapter 2, verse 10 of Hebrews. In chapter 2, verse 10, it says, "For it was fitting that he for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation, perfect through suffering." And he's talking about the suffering of his death and being made perfect through his suffering of death, through his obedience. He learned obedience and being made perfect. He became the source. Notice this phrase. He became the source. Jesus Christ became the source of eternal salvation. This goes back to what we see in the book of Acts, right? In a passage we should all place in memory. Acts chapter 4, verse 12. "There's no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved." He became the source of eternal salvation. His salvation is eternal because he is a priest that is reigning as a priest, working as a priest for eternity. He is a high priest for eternally. He is a high priest forever. He became the source of eternal salvation to all those who, notice this very important word. He is the source of eternal salvation to all those who obey him. It doesn't say in this text to all those who believe him. Certainly believing is important. And we're not trying to do a whole discussion on that right now. But, I'll remind you of a couple of phrases. The demons believe and tremble according to the book of James. So it's not just a belief that is under consideration here. It is a belief that is accompanied by obedience. He became the source of eternal salvation to all those who obey him. He became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God. And again, this goes back to that appointed, right? He was appointed by God. He was chosen by God. Back to verse 1, back to verse 4, back to verse 5. He was appointed. So it says here, verse 10, he was designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So Jesus Christ became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. And this should not catch us off guard. Jesus Christ himself called us to obedience. In the book of John, what do we see? We see that Jesus calls his followers to obedience. He says in verse 15 of John 14, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." Then he said that same thing in verse 21, "Whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me." So we shouldn't be surprised here that the Hebrew writer says that Jesus became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. And so here we have the Hebrew writer is highlighting the superiority of Jesus Christ once again. He is a better high priest than the high priests of the Old Testament. He is a high priest that is better because he serves forever. He's a high priest that is better because he is a sinless high priest. He doesn't have to offer sacrifices for his sins. He was sinless. He is a better high priest because he serves forever in this capacity in relationship to man. He was appointed to act on our behalf. So we should then, going back to verse 16, so we should be able to draw near with confidence. We should be able to know that we have someone there who is able to help us during our weaknesses. He will sympathize with our weaknesses. So we have a high priest and a king that we should be willing to obey and live for. I hope you guys have a blessed day. Again, please remember to like and subscribe. God bless.